Welcome to Unexpected Points. Your host, Kevin Cole here, joined by, I think I say very special guest all the time, but this is one of the many times where it's legit. Like it is very, very legit, and especially not only special just all times of year, all seasons, through all seasons, off season, playoffs, regular season, everything special would be a special guest, but especially special, a little redundant, but especially special this time of year because you have one of my favorite pieces that just came out with the NFL quarterback tiers. You're in the middle of a media blitz this morning that you're able to squeeze in some time for this lowly podcast / YouTube live stream. So I appreciate that. Mike Sando of the Athletic, thank you for joining me.
You forgot my number one thing on my resume is that I'm an Unexpected Points subscriber. That's a fact. And so when I see you sitting in the Marriott lobby at the hotel in the Combine, I make sure I come and sit down next to you. I don't walk by and avoid you because I think you do great work. So, and I know why you like the tiers. You like the tiers because as a data guy, this gives you a market analysis. It's helpful for you to say, okay, this is right or wrong. This is the best we have of what the league thinks. And so that's a great baseline for comparison. That's kind of why one of the reasons I like it too. Whether, we would all might change one thing or we might tweak the criteria or whatever, but this is what it is.
Yeah, now a couple things here. I want to, in my mind, and maybe this is just a combination of false modesty and imposter syndrome. I want to think that I came and sat down next to you and then at the Combine, but that may not be true. I think I did come up and introduce myself to you the first time.
Oh no, but I was thrilled because and when you showed me did you have maybe a Substack going then, or you had something going that I subscribed to on the spot. So, and I do look for it. I do look for it in I get the email and stuff. I'm always interested in what you're doing. So.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, I'm going to be pumping that up soon. And yeah, that's the most successful. I'm like door-to-door salesman for Substack. I just have to go to personally sell each person on it. So it takes a little time, but the Combine's a good place to do that. The other thing that I was going to say is that when it comes to this analysis, I've used it a lot. I mean, for those who haven't even had, I'll share a little bit here so people can get a little peek. Of course, go and subscribe to. Not that the New York Times needs more subscribers necessarily here, but go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and subscribe. Well, we need people to subscribe from your article, that's for sure. So the higher ups, when they're having their two martini lunches, they'll have an idea of like who's really driving this business here. It's not just all opinion columnists telling us whatever here. But look at this. I mean, look at these visualizations we have in here. We have the tiering. And if you dig in here, and this is what I like to dig into, it's not that interesting for Mahomes because everyone votes him tier one.
Go to Deshaun Watson. I think he would be a fun one.
Let's go to Deshaun Watson. You can see, as you see, some of these are already open because I've been perusing this here. But if you want to see someone, where is Watson?
Couple ticks higher.
Oh, here we go. I lost him in the. Where did he go here? Oh, here he is. So if you want to see a cliff dive in real time, everything that's going down there, and you can get the exact voting throughout time. And the methodology, I believe, is pretty much maintained and stayed the same. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because I think there was even some comments in here about, well, if you have to stick to the criteria, then I would view someone a certain way versus maybe another way. So that's something we'll talk about, how certain quarterbacks are viewed in here. So you have same methodology, similar grouping, a good, robust sample, as robust as you can get, of 50 NFL insiders for every year. And you have all of the tiering. So you're not just, sometimes when you get a rank ordering, and I'm probably guilty of this myself, sometimes the difference between 1 and 2 is really, really big, but then the difference between 2 and all the way to 6 isn't that big, but it's not necessarily reflected on the stuff that's pumped out on social media and other places. So you can get a really good idea of what's underlying these metrics.
Yeah. Like, there's only 3 guys in tier 1, right? Mahomes, Burrow, and Allen. But really, if you really kind of the top of tier 2, Lamar Jackson, Herbert, Stafford, Rodgers, those guys are all kind of tier 1.5. If you were really to look at this and say, you could put those guys almost in the same bucket as well as dividing them up. So, but the headline, of course, will be this guy was rejected from tier one or whatever, but it's close. It's really close for some of these guys, and you're right. Some of them, I mean, especially Lamar Jackson is interesting because uh, that he's a criteria breaker, really. And people will say, you know what, I understand he's got a little bit of a hole here, but I'm putting him in tier one anyway. And so that happens too sometimes. And that's why I talk to 50. If I talk to five, then one outlier here, outlier there has a big difference. There's definitely outliers. There's some people when I do this will have one person in tier one, and there could be someone else who has seven people in tier one. What's going on here? Well, we do 50 and it kind of smooths out. It's just enough.
Yeah, it's almost like in the Olympics when they do the judging and they throw out the lowest and the highest score.
Yeah.
Maybe there would be some of that. We don't have to worry about Russian judges though coming in and mucking things
No.
up. But I do think it's interesting when some guys. You don't want to read too much into like some guys getting 1 or 2 tier 1 votes versus some getting 0. But there is some of that I'm going to
Yeah.
address with some of these
Sure.
quarterbacks. All right, so
Yeah.
let's
Let's do it.
talk. And you already address this somewhat, which is basically, okay, we have this information. In my opinion, in the realm of NFL media, hot takery going out there and takes and getting reactions and engagement, not that hot, really, quite honestly, because of the methodology for what you're doing on things. But yet people will still have something to critique about what's going on here, but it's all about how you use it. Some people, I saw some complaints, and some people I follow who are, whatever, they're good people, but on Twitter they're a little hyperbolic about things, about how it's not predictive, and like, who cares because it's not predictive. Well, maybe it's not meant to be predictive. Like, we know who's being interviewed, we know the criteria. Maybe we should be focusing on what it means in that regard rather than worrying so much about we're going to beat the market somehow of ideas on how good these quarterbacks are by viewing this piece.
Yeah. I mean, does everything have to be about betting? I mean,
I
is that
guess
the way
so.
that people think
ESPN
about it?
bet. It's a
Like that's not like the betting that I'm interested in those markets for what they say about the odds of this or that happening, but it's not really the lens through which I enjoy. Everyone has different reasons why they enjoy the game or why they enjoy following it. I love the odds for like win totals and just kind of stacking the teams and looking at expectations and who would I think is going to overachieve them, or who am I wrong on, based on what the markets say. But for this type of a thing, I mean, that wouldn't be the value to me. I mean, if you don't enjoy going through and kind of thinking about what is most important at the position, and what's in your mind and what you can learn from people in the league who have maybe different perspectives or whatnot, like there's a lot of stuff here to me that is interesting and of value, whether I agree, disagree, or can make money betting on you know, whatever.
Okay, so here's a couple things. So we talk about data. So I'll come right off the top with a little bit of a nerdy thing that I looked at here. I was interested just to see in aggregate how the quarterback landscape is being viewed. People are going to focus on the individuals going up or down and things of that nature. I was a little surprised. And again, maybe year over year, it's not quite apples to apples when you're comparing the tiering. But when I just did a real simple exercise of adding up the average tiering numbers for the top 10 quarterbacks and then for 11 through 20, both of them, top 10 was pretty close year over year, but both of them ended up being a lower number, which in this context means better because there's more in tier one as opposed to tier two, more in tier two as opposed to tier three. Yet we had a poor offensive season overall in the
Yeah.
NFL. But I think we had some guys emerge there. So how do you put those two things together?
Well, I don't think that people in the league are at all looking at stats when they do this. Well, there's no one in here who is citing the things that uh, you or me or anyone else who loves to dig into the research as their basis for what they're feeling or thinking, right? They're not like, well, actually, this guy's third down EPA per dropback. It, I've never had that. Like, no one in the league talks about that ever. So they're looking at things like, who do we have to have a special game plan for and why? When we when we are trailing Tom Brady, when we're leading Tom Brady 28-3, are we afraid that our defensive coordinator is going to run out of coverages? Or are we thinking when we have a 28-3 lead on this other quarterback, oh my gosh, we're going to feast. This is amazing, guys. You're going to all get game balls. That's how they that's how people in the league know in their heart and in their mind who's real, right? Who do you fear playing? Who do you relish playing? And to what degree? You know that just from being in the games, right? You don't need a stat board or hey, scoring was down this last year. I think the amount that scoring's down, what was it down? Was it down a half a point or a point or uh,
Something of that nature,
not?
yeah.
Yeah, not super noticeable. Probably. I mean, it's notable, but I don't think it's going to affect necessarily or be reflected in the voting from year to year. The panel could change some from year to year. It's not the same 50 people. You know, there's definitely turnover. I have more than 50 people that I could include in it. And sometimes I just get to 50 before I get to some guys that were in it last year, or the year before, or whatever. And I mix it up a little bit too. So that could explain some of that variance. And I look at the individual voters too. I have a what's their average for the whole thing, and there can be a range. You know, there's people singing in different octaves here, right? There's some people who, like I said, have one person in tier one, and another person might have seven, and they just view things differently. And sometimes it says as much about the voters as it does about the quarterbacks, right? There's some people who are coaches in the league who feel like they could win with a lot of guys. They're optimistic, and sometimes you'll get some offensive coaches, for example, could just feel like, let's go. Yeah, they might have a little bit of a higher grade on some people, whereas maybe a defensive guy sometimes could be like, guy doesn't scare us. You kidding me? I mean, there's three guys that do. Okay, bottom line, if you were talking about number one receivers or something, you'd be like, there's five guys we game plan for. These other guys got good stats. Not worried. That's their criteria.
So let me talk a little bit about in the same sort of vein, like I was gonna say biases, but it'd be more like perspectives that people
Yeah,
have, unless these things that I've noticed, and this will be context from when we start to get into the individual players, and as we talk about the individual quarterbacks, more topics will come up. So here's what I've noticed, and you tell me whether or not um, you think this is interesting. I think it is a little bit slower to react than especially like the week to week sort of nature of everyone's going up and down, where fans are either over the moon, ecstatic, or they're in long-term depression, depending upon what happens with the teams and with different quarterbacks on a year by year basis. So I think it's a little bit slower to react on both sides. So for instance, Brock Purdy makes a big jump this year after he, in limited time, had a pretty good year the year before, but didn't quite make that jump. Maybe the same for someone like Tua, where it's really like the second year. And then even for
yeah,
guys like CJ Stroud, who a lot of media people are putting as, a top five-ish sort of quarterback already. The NFL executives are going to say, okay, number 2 overall pick, fantastic rookie year, but let me see a little bit more before I'm willing to put him up there and have that sort of confidence in what he can do.
totally. You're 100% right. And Stroud actually set the record. So Stroud came in at eighth on this list. He set the record for any second year quarterback debuting in quarterback tiers. And just remember, no rookies are ever in it. So since 2014 is when I started this, I think he broke Herbert's record for somebody to come in that high. So this is high for him. And I actually was a little surprised he went this high. He got 12 tier one votes. And usually people are, hey, it was nice, but I got to see it again. One thing I wonder about on the perception of Stroud is were we all wrong and the league all wrong on the team that was around him? I think people looked at that situation before the year, including me, and said, hey, look, we have, the organization's been in some turmoil. We're not real confident in the roster. We have a first time head coach who's on defense. We have a first time offensive coordinator who comes from a good tree but is totally unproven. I mean, and now you're going to throw a rookie quarterback into that? And then you looked at their early schedule last year. They're playing Baltimore. They're playing all these teams that had good defenses. I thought this guy's going to have a hard time. Well, then he did really well. But in retrospect, after the season, you know what? That offensive line was pretty good. The receivers there were pretty good. Hey, D'Amico Ryan seems pretty good. Slowick, nice job calling the games. Now, did Stroud boost all those guys up, or was the situation actually better than we thought? And he benefited in ways that we didn't expect, yet we assigned the credit to him disproportionately because we thought it all sucked in Houston going into the year. Is that what do you think of that?
No, no, I think that's true. I think there's a weird thing where if you think about, I mean, let's think about something like MVP voting, maybe. So if Brock Purdy plays well with a stacked roster, I think he gets a little bit more penalized maybe in people's
Yeah.
minds for that than when, Mahomes, when he had Tyreek Hill or something like he had Tyreek Hill and Kelsey and good offensive line and a pretty stacked roster. But we know we believe in Mahomes already, so therefore it doesn't really become as big of a part of the argument. And I think you're right. I mean, the biggest data point, I guess, would be Nico Collins getting a huge contract year over year, where you don't pay someone that type of money as a former third round pick, I think,
Yeah.
who hadn't really done anything until last year, unless you're confident that he has like some value independent of who his quarterback is.
Totally. Yep. I agree. I think that we also watch the players and we can tell that there's differences. There's lots of guys in the NBA who've averaged 23 points per game. They're not all the same, right? They're not all uh, you watch one and you watch a different one and they could be completely different in how much you think one's better than the other, right? And so I think in this case, Mahomes, there's an eye test factor with Mahomes too. He can just do some amazing things that look different, pull rabbits out of the hat. I think Purdy certainly has been hurt a little bit in this by the fact that he was a seventh round pick. No one has a prototype of this. We want, my gosh, did you see Purdy warming up? Can we get one of those? There's no one doing that. And then we know he has a great supporting cast and a really good offensive schemer. So it took him a while. After the first 5 or 6 games, no one was moving him up. They said, let's see it again. I thought he actually came up pretty good and into tier two. Like if he was in tier three still, I think that would show us some real skepticism or almost stubbornness. But if you produce consistently at a high level, you're going to get some of the credit. You just are. And so he moves into tier two. It feels about right to me.
Yeah, yeah. I like the "do you see this guy warming up" test. I mean, for a real life example, I live out in Maryland, and there's the Catholic schools are pretty good around here. Actually, Caleb Williams is from the area, so I saw where he went to school, Gonzaga, warming up against this Our Lady of Good Counsel, where Stephon Diggs went to school. But so we were at the game with my sons, and the quarterbacks were warming up. I knew nothing about anything, and I saw one of the quarterbacks, and I was like, "See that guy? He's a starter. Like that guy is a starter, not
Yes.
the other guys. Trust me." That and
Yes.
then of course he was the starter, even though knowing nothing, there were three different quarterbacks all warming up on the sideline.
Totally. Yeah. I think we should take into account within reason. I mean, but there's different ways these guys can do things that influence the wow factor, right? It's kind of that's what it is. It's a wow factor.
Okay, let's get into some of these names here. Because this Josh Allen is the topic of the day. Because I guess there was some polling by players saying he was most overrated. I'm a little bit surprised, but I guess it's always going to be a quarterback because you have to players kind of just like who they have to know someone's name and like think of them right off the top of their heads, and they have to have some sort of consensus. And it can't be Mahomes. Probably can't be Lamar Jackson after he just won MVP. So maybe he just kind of fell into that bucket here. But he was also somewhat attracted attention here by the smallest of margins, by zero point 0.1 on the aggregated tiering scale. He's below Joe Burrow, still in tier one overall, but slightly below Joe Burrow on this. So that's attracted a lot of attention. Were you surprised to see that? And what is it about
Yeah.
him that's standing out? Is it kind of encapsulated by the blurbs you had in here about the interceptions, things like that? Is it results based?
Yeah.
The fact that he's only made it to one AFC championship going up against Mahomes and the Chiefs all the time? Like, what do you think it is that maybe has
Yeah.
people a little bit lower on him?
I think it is the perception and reality that he will have more big blow up negative plays unnecessarily. There's a little bit of a frustration with that because we can see how good he is. And I, in one of the discussions I had on Twitter, X, I guess, was, hey,
You can call it Twitter. You can call it
it
Twitter.
was Nate Tice was saying,
Yeah.
hey, his success rate on pass plays was high, and I said yes, but I keep a in my nerdy little stat dashboard. I've got a column for disaster plays, and it's just a cutoff of any play that loses 3 EPA or more. I could make it 2.5 or 3.5, but that's what I got. And the Bills over the last, whatever, 2 or 3 years are like in the top 3 or 4 in that. Now they have a lot of really great plays too, but that's a high number of disaster plays for such a good quarterback. And he's always been a little bit of an untamed wild horse out there, right? When he started out in the league, it was a lot of bad plays without as many good. Now there's way more good. He's a tier one quarterback. I mean, everybody would like to have Josh Allen, but could we just turn a couple of those dials and not have some of those where you're like, what was he thinking? And they happen less than they used to, but there's still enough of them. I think that's the only complaint. That's the only reason that 11 voters didn't put him in tier one.
Yeah, no, it might also feed into what you were talking about earlier about coaches viewing different types of quarterbacks and saying, if you just don't make those mistakes, I can get a win. I can get a win. But if if you give me a couple of bad turnovers, then I can't. My hands are tied. Like no matter what I do to scheme or to go around it, then I might lose on this one. And I'm also wondering whether does Josh Allen now, should we put him in the same bucket maybe as Lamar Jackson, whose perception has
Yeah.
shifted a bit year over year, or Jalen Hurts or someone where if you say in the description as part of tier one, he expertly handles pure passing situations and he was worse passing last year and kind of better rushing than some other years, whether he
Yeah.
now gets that discount for a rushing quarterback.
I actually do think there's overlap between Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, but people do feel like if they had to be in a situation where we're down by, 7 or 10 points in the fourth quarter and had to throw it every down, people would rather they'd have more confidence in Josh Allen's ability to handle that. And I think you know, in the Ravens case, they don't have many of those, and should get a lot of credit for that. But and Buffalo has too. I mean, they're really good defensive teams, so they rarely are in that type of a situation. But clearly, that's the dividing line. Like that's why Lamar's fourth in this, and he's almost tier one. If I called 3 different people who put him in tier one, he would be at the bottom of tier one. That's how close it is. It's super close. But that's the one thing in the back of people's minds with Lamar is like they don't feel it looks as good when he absolutely when he kind of has to play left-handed, meaning the run game and scrambling really isn't a big part of the picture. We have to go throw the ball. And so as I've developed this criteria, not mine, but from talking to people in the league, I have sometimes asked, hey, this tier one description carries his team each week. Team wins because of him. Expertly handles pure pass. No real holes in his game. Does that pure pass clause? Hey, is it a changing league and the pure pass clause shouldn't be in there? And no, people still say, even people who would put Lamar in tier one would still say, no, the game does get reduced to that in critical moments, and that is a test that needs to be passed. And so I think for some of these quarterbacks, uh, like Dak Prescott, over a long period of time, he's been a really good quarterback, but in those moments when he could put on his back and throw his team to win in big playoff games, it hasn't happened yet. And I think as the sample size gets larger in those moments and you have a 10-year history of it, it's legitimate. In a shorter run of a couple seasons, anything could happen, and it may not be reflective of what you're at. But for Lamar, he's 2-4 in the playoffs with a 75 passer rating or whatever, and there's been enough of those games when it looked like he couldn't do it as well that just a few people have held that back. But there's great quotes in the thing on Lamar. I love the quotes like, are we on some kind of a high horse if we're putting him in tier two? This is a 2-time MVP. And then I go, wait a minute. What's the criteria for an MVP? Oh, there is none. Okay, there's no criteria. I've had nobody say to this, Patrick Mahomes in tier one, he was 7th in MVP last year. What are you talking about? I've never heard anybody say Dak Prescott was second in MVP last year. Why isn't he in tier one, right? So the MVP thing is probably better than the Heisman, but I don't think it should be anybody's criteria either uh, for something an exercise like this where there's clear criteria. When there's no criteria, we can't even agree what an MVP is.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. And going back to the usefulness of the analysis and the data there, I mean, I, just pulled all the stole all that intellectual property, put it into my own piece last offseason where I was talking about Lamar Jackson during the franchise tag negotiations. Why isn't anyone making an offer for him? And despite what people may say, you could dig into this data and say, look, even after the 2019 MVP season, he got a bump, but he wasn't clearly in that tier one category. And he hadn't reached the same levels that we had seen for several other quarterbacks like Burrow or even Josh Herbert or guys that didn't have that much of a history who had reached some sort of bar when it came to the pure passing ability that they had that Lamar Jackson hadn't. There was this, it wasn't as simple as everyone saying, why doesn't, I can't believe no team is coming in here and giving up 2 first-round picks and bidding for him. Like there was a sustained opinion about him in the NFL that it wasn't hidden at all. It shouldn't have been that much of a surprise.
Well, yeah, but also I always thought that argument was so easy for people to make, but it's so flawed. It's not that people didn't want to have Lamar Jackson as their quarterback. Of course they do. It was what you had to do to make that happen. So, okay, we're going to offer so much money that Baltimore won't match. So what's that number? And
Yep.
then we're going to give up 2 number ones. And then we're going to change our whole offense because the Ravens have done a wonderful job of maximizing exactly what he does, but it's been a process of setting up their team a certain way. So it was all the things you had to do to get him that made it a reason not to do it. Not do you want the player? I think if Lamar Jackson were a free agent, he could have named his price, and I think that's proven. I mean, Kirk Cousins reached free agency and went to near the very top of the market at a time when he was a losing quarterback. We know he had a bad defense and all of that. I'm not advocating for quarterback wins, but in the perception world, no one would have said that Kirk Cousins was a top 5 quarterback when he reached the market, but he was able to get that kind of money. So you have to pay attention to what people would have to do and how realistic it would be to actually get him. And I think teams totally defensively weren't willing to do all those things, which, by the way, he had missed a bunch of games too. It wasn't like he had been playing full seasons or anything either. There were some questions.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, if anything, it just helped give an additional piece of evidence of the bar is really, really high in that circumstance. In other words, to do all those things, and you have to really be in that solidly way up in the tier one sort of category for that to happen, and it hadn't quite happened there. But what do you think about the fact? I guess we'll talk about Jackson, where I think he benefited not necessarily, and this is weird for me to say because he was the MVP, but I don't know if he actually played that much better other than a stretch at the end of the season. Um, for the first half of the season when the defense was playing really well, but they were throwing the ball more often. So
Oh yeah,
the
yeah,
fact that it was a bigger like proportion of their offense, even if their offense was way better in
yes.
2019, when he wasn't throwing the ball as often and making a ton of big plays, I think that kind of helped him a little bit in this perception.
Oh, no doubt. Well, he rocketed up. I mean, his 23 votes in tier one is more than he had in multiple years combined previously. I think since after his MVP season. So there's no doubt people felt like he made strides as a passer, for sure. And I think he did. I mean, it was a good season for him. But you know, when you looked at last season doing the MVP, I struggled with it too. I was like, I think he was 13th in EPA per pass play last season. And in the end, I just had a hard time. The MVP thing, there's not really a criteria. I was like, okay, this is the leading passer and leading rusher on one of the most dominant teams in regular season history. They were beating great teams and winning big, and he was playing well. Not amazing, not close to his MVP levels in 2019 statistically, but to me, it was enough to say, kind of in a weird year, I voted for him for the MVP. Do I think he's the best quarterback? No, but it's a team. It's a little bit of a team, individual results, stats, hodgepodge of things to do it, and I thought that was fine for him, but it wouldn't at all apply to, you know, this type of an exercise where you have clearly defined criteria.
One rating that was a little bit head scratching for me was Matthew Stafford this year. Now, he went up significantly not only in his ranking, but also in the voting average here, where he has 21 tier one votes, where it was, believe it or not, one last
Yeah.
season, which I was a little bit surprised by. I guess that injury shortened, turnover plagued season was affected things because he was at 18 tier one votes the year before, where he played well and they went through and they won the Super Bowl. Well, I don't know what's going on. I guess Stafford is, even now we're talking about a decade into his career, someone whose perception can jump up and down a lot just based upon what we've seen in the most recent season.
A little bit, yeah. He's one of those guys who maybe more than anybody, had the run of team futility where you're trying to figure out how much of it's his responsibility. Would a better quarterback lead them to greater heights than he did in Detroit? And then he goes to a really good organization that, by the way, had a good defense with a really good head coach and Sean McVay, and he wins the Super Bowl. So that's extreme, And I think last year it really helped him played more of a full season, and then I think there was non expectations on the team uh, and he was a big driving force, I think, and he was a decent MVP candidate last year, don't you think? He would have been on my short list of MVP guys last year. So one box he certainly checks is the pure pass component. I mean, people feel like he's really got that. I think the questions on him are just at his age: is he declining? Can he hold up over a full season more than anything else?
How do we think about Jalen Hurts now? Because I thought he was a little bit interesting. Um, he
Yeah.
had fallen a bit year over year, and maybe this is kind of looking at some of the value and not adjusting too quickly. Although he was top six last
He
year.
went. I think he went from seventh. No, was it sixth? He went seventh to 11th. He might have been sixth last year. I had Tom Brady in the poll before it published, and then I think we took him out just in case he played. So he might have gone from sixth to 11th. Is
He
that
was he
right?
was kind of a weaker six, so kind of like a tier drop last year because he had 10 tier one votes, and that is despite the fact that he was the clear second candidate when it came to MVP voting behind Patrick Mahomes, an excellent Patrick Mahomes season. So it wasn't like it was just
Yeah.
a moderate Patrick Mahomes season. But maybe this is, again, looking at the value of the exercise. They didn't move up. The NFL executives didn't move up on him too quickly. Gave him 10 tier one votes that year, and now it's down to only one. A pretty big move in the other direction. Yet again, still only 10 out of 50 were willing to put him into tier one, despite the fact that he was seen as being the second best
Yeah.
quarterback in the NFL last year.
I love the not overreacting nature. It's funny during the season, usually about halfway through or a little later, I'll do a column called Quarterback Tiers Revisited, and we'll just go through and see how many of you guys would change. But you know what? If you repolled everybody, it wouldn't like guys aren't in the league are not like changing their entire evaluation off of a month or 2 months. Unless it's somebody who hadn't played at all before. Some of these guys have played. Like I like that component of this, that we're not all over the map, that it takes a while. Like we've watched Russell Wilson fall, but it's like a snapshot in time. Each year he's going down a little more instead of everybody just making him a five, and saying he's not a starter. I like that nature of it, and I think it's probably appropriate because there are so many, I mean, the division of credit is one of the hardest things to figure out in football. And so uh, to just look at the results and make a knee jerk reaction, I think a lot of people were like, there's some factors going on in Philly, and I was not impressed with how he handled some of those situations. Like the pure passing was one of them. It looked bad sometimes when they really had to put it on his shoulders. And so some questions were re raised on him, but people just didn't throw in the towel either. They're like, hey, Shane Steichen leaving was a big deal. They were in a little bit disarray on their staff. Let's see what it looks like this year.
Now, three guys who I like to bucket together in this. We can win with them, but perhaps we're not winning because of them, and that's reflected in the tiering here. Are Goff, who's had a much longer career, and Brock Purdy, and Tua Tagovailoa, who's had relatively short careers. Although Tua has now been paid a little bit on the later side. It wasn't an immediate first available offseason getting paid, but
Right.
he got his bag eventually. Purdy, he's probably going to get paid eventually when it happens, unless things fall off a cliff this year. I mean, stranger things have happened, but they're going to have a pretty good team. So we'll see there. Goff just got this huge extension now, and he's moved up in the tiering up to number 10, but I think it's a little bit of a fragile 10th overall. I think that's probably where he's going to top out. I don't know if he can get much higher than that. Still only 2 tier 1 votes in for him within the 50. So not too big of a sample there, and then 0 for the others. I'm kind of wondering, and maybe you have some idea on this. Like, could we get to a capitulation sort of point on here where people flood these guys with tier 1 votes eventually? Obviously not for Goff, but maybe for someone like Purdy. Or do you think this is probably where they're locked in on here, and these are the guys that we put in that you can win with them, but maybe not because of them bucket?
I think if Brock Purdy were to put up the same stats he did last year for 10 years, I mean, he's going to be in tier 1 at a certain point. You can't deny that type of consistent production over time, and that would happen for him. I think we're in a world where uh, teams are probably doing a better job than ever, at least some, of not looking for the perfect QB that they want, but making the most of the one they have and finding out the best way to win with their guy. And so that's how you can see such extreme results during their career for a Goff or a Tua, who were in really unfavorable situations early in their career and then got with super favorable extreme ones on the other end. And the results and the look is totally different. So a lot of these guys in that 2 and 3 category, even they could look a lot different based on what's around them, right? Whereas I think we would all think that Josh Allen's a powerhouse. Like you were saying, they could fall off this next year with what's around him, but we would still be able to recognize that this guy's got a lot of horsepower, right? You'd say he's a different athlete even than those other guys are, and we can recognize that. So I don't know how high they can go. Like Tua playing the exact same way he's playing now, I don't think could get to tier 1. I think people recognize that when it breaks down for him, it looks bad. So that would have to change. It feels like when it's really right for him, he can really, he's a great driver of a Lamborghini, right? But if you made him get in an old beater car, like you don't feel like he could get you around the track. And so uh, Purdy's a little different than that because he can do some things off schedule more. I think people feel like he scrambles around, he makes some things happen. And so we'll see what that develops into over the course of his career. Certainly not elite in running around, but there's he's not dead to rights when the play goes bad. He can kind of do a little bit more. Um, and then Goff is just a classic pocket guy who probably has to have it more right around him.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think Purdy can get there. I think that's maybe one of the unrecognized aspects when it comes to how we view these different quarterbacks is that, I mean, if you literally always put up good numbers, it's pretty hard. Like, I understand for Tua, he wasn't very good as a rookie, and he wasn't very good the second year, and now we have Tyreek Hill and others coming into play, and we'll see what happens after that. But like a helpful exercise for me is when I did looking at the total career arc and ranking guys and their value over time. I mean, there are some guys we probably could have argued were not justified as tier 1 for a few years and how they were viewed, whether it's Drew Brees or I don't know. I mean, Dan Fouts
Yeah.
eventually made a huge jump in his career. Fran Tarkenton, some of these other sort of
Sure.
guys, where eventually you had to give in and say these guys are really Hall of Fame level type of players. Maybe they're not, the elite of the elite NFL 100 Hall of Fame type of players, but they're really, really good players. I mean, even Joe Montana, I'm not sure if people would have said necessarily at the beginning of his career that he wasn't just a function of the West Coast offense and what was going on with Bill Walsh there. So I think Purdy can make it there, and I'm not sure if enough people recognize that he
Well,
he could potentially make it there.
yeah. So what'll happen to him though is now they've been winning a lot too. They have a good defense and all of that, so that helps him too. Good offense and winning. So what happens now? They pay him. Now you're not signing the Leonard Floyds of the world. You know what? We can't have Trent Williams on our team. We can't even re-sign the next Fred Warner or whoever it is, right? Because we're the next guy that they would like to keep, but is super expensive. So then now you're ranked 22nd on defense, and your offensive line's one of the 10 worst in the league, and you've got some good weapons and a great schemer, but now you're scrambling to be 10th on offense, and you're 9-8. That could happen to him too. And what does it look like then, right? What are we? It's impractical to think that they're going to be this good with this kind of talent around them forever. Just not It's not going to happen. I've even been surprised that like last year their main guys basically played the whole time, right? Debo and Christian McCaffrey and Trent Williams. These are all guys that any one of them, if they missed Kittle, any one of them, if they missed 10 games in here, you wouldn't be surprised at all. They all pretty much played 15, 16 games. How long is that happening for? So I think this will solve itself, right? He is going to have to go through situations that are less optimal than he's in now, and that'll help us.
Yeah, and I think we've also seen in these optimal situations, and this is what we talked about earlier for Lamar Jackson getting somewhat of a reputational benefit just from throwing it more often. They don't. I mean, they don't throw it that often there, even versus what you'd expect based upon score. I have my nerd stuff for figuring
Yeah,
that
yeah.
stuff
You're
out.
talking about the 49ers? 49ers,
Yeah, the
yeah.
49ers. Yeah, they still with Purdy don't throw it over expectation, even when you account for the fact that they're winning and they're up all the time. So you expect to throw it less when you're up all the time, but they still don't. Whereas,
Hey,
if this was Mahomes or if this was Peyton Manning, trust me, they would be throwing it over expectation even when they're winning by a lot.
absolutely. And one thing we should look at now, I think they did I do the little Cook index thing, which is just what's your how frequently do you pass on first and second down in the first 28 minutes of the game before score differential and time remaining really start to influence. And what can be helpful there is just to like look at Kyle Shanahan for all of his quarterbacks, because I think it would show that with Matt Ryan he wanted to pass more than he did with others. But I think Purdy closed some of that gap last year. I'd have to look if it was the whole year or the second half of the year. I remember doing something in my pick six column on the Athletic at some point, going, "Ooh." I felt like we were getting to Matt Ryan territory. Like, hey, Shanahan must be feeling it. I think that's a great barometer for how these quarterbacks or how these coaches feel about their guy, and some of it's what's around them, but how they feel about their guy. And so this is very interesting to me with Lamar Jackson too, because they were always super low on the Cook Index. They weren't wanting to throw it because they have a great running game and a great defense and an amazing lower volume pass game where they're huge EPA, right? These big gainers. So what is that going to look like? Because they signaled with Derrick Henry. You sign Derrick Henry if he's on the field in first and second down. Guess what? He's not a pass catcher. He's not a
Yeah.
vertical threat. He's going to be getting the ball. Is this going to be a season where they pivot back a little bit after what happened in the playoffs and say, you know what, we're going to be a running team again, or is it going to be a continuation of what we saw last year? Let's go. Let's open it up a little bit more for Lamar and become more of a passing team. The head coach determines that through his own vision for how he thinks the game wants to be played in a case like in a situation like Harbaugh, a little bit more of a defensive special teams mindset for him. He's not going to be as comfortable just opening it up. Kyle can be talked into it. His mind can go there, but he has to feel like his quarterback can do it. And so I love that. I love those types of barometers for play callers, especially for the guys that are at the extremes.
Yeah. You're right. At the end of the second half, when I mean, they struggled. For the 49ers struggling, it means they were clearly dominant. And then they had, the bad performance against the Ravens and others where it dropped them out of having the best record in the NFL. Yeah, they were willing to, or I should say, well, it's not even willing to let the quarterback throw. It's just sometimes you don't preference, let's keep it
Yeah.
close, cross our fingers, and things will hopefully go right at the end. They weren't
Yeah.
doing that as much.
And the Cook Index is called that because it's a let rest Cook Index. It was the whole debate in Seattle: is Pete Carroll holding back this amazing passer, Russell Wilson? Why aren't we throwing it more? And we got our answer. When they
Yeah,
did, it wasn't quite as good,
we did.
you know. And
Yeah,
we can stand here on a mountaintop and say that you're throwing away plays by running because you get more EPA for passing. Well, it's not really that simple either. There's a
definitely,
diminishing returns
definitely.
at a certain point with some of these guys.
Okay, guys who we've moved up, they moved up on the index. So moved a lot up on Jordan Love. We also mentioned CJ Stroud already, where this
Yeah,
is like these are big moves in the context of
yeah,
the the tiering. Yet these are two guys, again, I'm commonly seeing these guys seen as being even higher. Maybe prospectively, maybe people are just really predicting another leap for them, which may or may not come. How do you think about I guess
yeah,
Love, since we talked about Stroud a
yeah.
bit?
So Love is a big gainer this year, kind of, and Purdy was too. Now, what happens though is when guys like that debut artificially low because the criteria for tier four is either a veteran who's you wouldn't want to start the whole season, so that could be like, hey, Gardner Minshew or Ryan Fitzpatrick. At certain they're good backups, they can start for you, but you wouldn't want to go the whole year. Or tier four is not enough information. I the guy's made 4 starts, so Patrick Mahomes debuts in tier four because he had 1 start. It wasn't anybody who was saying he was bad. They're just I got to give him a 4, but here's what I think about him. And so Purdy and Love were 4s because they hadn't played hardly at all, not because people thought they were terrible. And so that's how you can make a big gain year over year. You debut as a 4 when no one's really seen you, and now all of a sudden you're higher. But it is notable to go to tier 2 for Jordan Love, and the quotes on him I thought were gushing. I thought his were super positive, like people were kind of buying in. And so, uh, even though all the games weren't good, even late in the year, I think they played Tampa, the last playoff game. But people are, I think, for tiers standards, this is a pretty high debut to come right into tier 2.
Yeah. I mean, we had basically very, very little from Love before, so that totally makes sense. Now we did have a bit more from Purdy, to be honest, but the seventh round pick, all that sort of stuff, they were probably a bit more
Kyle
down on him.
and Kyle siphons off credit. Those elite callers, uh, like if we were to go on to Pro Football Reference and look at the all-time leaders in yards per attempt or adjusted net yards per attempt, like Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be like in a mix of guys with Marinos and just all the guys are all-time greats.
Nick
Like he's going to
Mullins
be
famously, Nick Mullins
yeah. There's
famously had
some
a good
yeah.
yards
Some
per
of those guys are
attempt
going to be
with
super
him. So
high.
yeah.
So those things there's a little bit of a tax sometimes on the Purdy's of the world, probably rightfully so because we've seen like we know Garoppolo's fine, but he's not special. Yet he can have special numbers with Kyle.
Okay, last guy I want to talk about, and I think again this is where the rankings make it look like a bigger move optically than what it was. Where
Mm-hmm.
if you look at Trevor Lawrence and you say, okay, this is a guy who was eighth going into 2023 on the index, had some tier one votes, some people are starting to buy in, hadn't seen a lot, but we did see the playoff comeback. He made it to the playoffs. He got that playoff, very improbable playoff comeback. Second half of the season was pretty good, still a very up and down 2022. Now we come into 2023. I don't know if he played that much worse, but the results were
Yeah.
worse. The perception is worse. And rankings wise, he falls from eighth to 16th, which seems like a huge drop. Tiering a decimal point wise is a point 0.4 drop, so it's not as big. But no one is ranking him as a tier one quarterback in the same offseason that he signs, the biggest contract in the NFL. How do we put those things together?
Yeah. Lawrence was, I think, 8-3 last year at a certain time and then got hurt. But the tenor around him changed. I felt like going into last year, it was an optimistic upswing. Hey, we're finally seeing it. Let's throw away the Urban Meyer year. But it felt like a tenor of disappointment that even with whatever he was dealing with, people wanted to see more consistency. And even really, when you looked at when they were 8-3, I don't think it was because their offense was a juggernaut at all either. So there, you start to get a wait, is something missing? Like somebody put him together with Herbert a little bit and just said, hey, these are kind of two guys with kind of mild-mannered personalities that are on organizations that have struggled and aren't putting them necessarily in the best light, but still the talent seemed to be such that we would want to see more from them anyway, right? A little bit of that. So I think it's probably a big year for him in the quarterback tiers. If he has a disappointing year, I mean, he's going to settle into tier three. And even now, there were some people saying, I don't know if his ceiling's, I don't see the specialness. I think the ceiling might be in the twos, or even a lower two. So that was a shift on Lawrence.
Yeah, he's interesting because I think if you look at him, where he's positioned in this kind of third overall tier of quarterbacks. So between Tua and then Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield, Derek Carr, Geno Smith, Russell Wilson, the next guy's there. I mean, I don't know. Like, I see a case for him if he has a really great season. I mean, he could get all the way close to tier one. I have a feeling it's
I agree. I think
possible.
he has huge volatility. I think he has huge upward mobility. I agree. I mean,
Right, I
at
don't see that for
least
any of those other names. Like any of those other names in there, I mean, Kyler Murray maybe could take a decent jump, but I still don't think he would get the same bump that Lawrence would get if he
agree.
really put together one of those seasons.
Agree. At the same time, so when I've had the results finalized, one of my first impressions was, "Ooh, that seems like a big drop and too low for Lawrence." Was kind of my initial. He had all those drop passes. He was injured. He had multiple injuries in the year. You have to take that into account. They changed the offense because he couldn't move. And so I was willing to maybe cut him more slack. But then when I looked at who was above him, I was like, I don't know that I feel like I would want to move him above anybody off of last year either. He just kind of has to play and play well, play better for a year, and then he'll earn it on his own. But I agree. I think he could go up. I think Kyler could too. I do think that Kyler Murray. I felt like in doing this, uh, if I had to put into tiers how good each one of the write ups was on these guys, like the write up, there was not enough new on Kyler. It was like no one. I didn't feel like people had as much to offer on him. I was a little frustrated by it. But what are you going to talk about? I mean, he's coming off of an ACL. I think his stock got cratered by that contract clause where he had to do his homework or else he was in
Right.
trouble.
He
Had to
had to
go to
get off the
detention.
video games, right?
It killed him. That really normalized and the talk about him that people are it's hard for people to say, well, I don't know if he's really the guy or works at it or those types of intangibles. Like it killed his intangible meter, killed it in the public and in the league. And then you have an injury and miss part of the year. I think his stock is very depressed for somebody who, yes, he has limitations and you have to play a certain way with him. He's not going to work in any system, but I feel like that's a team that could surprise us a little almost. Like Kyler Murray does not suck. Kyler Murray, you could win some games. I mean, they've had good records, and they were 7-1 with him once, I think. Right? Couldn't he be a low tier two guy at least? Uh, and if that offense is really good and they scheme it right with a kind of an unknown, unproven coordinator, but he's coming out of that Stefanski world, Drew Petzing is. I think people were generally impressed with their scheming last year for what they had, and they were playing with Josh Dobbs and all kinds of different quarterbacks. I mean, Colt McCoy was their presumed starter at this time last year. Okay. So I think he's interesting. I think Kyler's interesting.
Yeah, he was in legitimate MVP-ish sort of conversations after the first half of 2020. But we are talking about a while ago, and I think he's unique in that he did end up playing, and it's almost weird to say that, oh, wait a second, this guy actually started 8 games last year. Like, you kind of forget that it even happened
No one
because
noticed.
they were dead. They were dead in the water before he took a snap. They were already basically, for all intents and purposes, knocked out of the playoffs. So this is a guy, and he missed a lot of the second half of the year before. He played a couple of games where they were kind of already out of the playoffs too. It's been a really long time since he's taken like meaningful snaps in terms of the team winning.
And if he's now had two camps to absorb the offense, he's had time to learn the offense, and if they do a great job of scheming it for him, I don't see why he can't look more glass half full than glass half empty. I think people are really looking at him as glass half empty, but I think that glass could be fuller this year than it's been for a while for him. And then I don't know, is it possible that a young guy can mature a little bit? I don't know if he's going to be humbled or in any way, but you know, he's got something to prove, in my opinion. And I don't know what his mindset is, but he has some talent, and if they scheme it really well for him, I think it could be better than it's been.
Well, we have seen guys, and I don't know, this is a very weird comparison because you're talking about like Ben Roethlisberger and then also Andrew Luck, these big, huge guys, really shift the way they play based upon taking too many hits. Now, but mostly within the context of the pocket, where they have to really learn how to play a different way, less kind of, especially when it came to Roethlisberger, less backyard football type of thing. So, yeah, I mean, there probably is at least motivation there for Murray to say, you know what? I can't just run around all the time. I really do have to learn how to execute this passing offense if I want to have a meaningful NFL career.
Yes, although I always thought he would. I mean, look, when he was hurt, it was just a non-contact injury. I felt like well, I'm afraid of him getting hit because he's really small. I mean, it stands out. You can't you notice how small he is when you watch him. It's but I always felt like he was a step ahead of the law a lot of times. Like he pitter patters those feet at the sideline and gets out. And he's kind of, you can just picture him holding that ball kind of on his outside hand, and he doesn't get lit up as he goes around. That would be actually a pretty good study to look at all of his touches and see and categorize the hits and the hit types. I did that several years ago for Lamar Jackson to see, okay, is he taking hits or not? And Lamar back then surprisingly would like turn back into contact unnecessarily all the time and do that. But I don't perceive Kyler to do that.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there are also, I mean, RG3 is another one who took way too many hits when he probably didn't need to. I think they have done these studies, which I think have been useful, but then also maybe a bit deceptive or leading to the wrong conclusion, where they say, well, you know what, you're much more likely to get injured when you get hit in the pocket in reality than when you're out of the pocket. The problem is, if you're a running quarterback, you're just putting yourself in position to get hit more often. So yeah, there's a less likelihood of getting injured, but you're accumulating more hits basically by getting
So
outside of the pocket.
yeah, well, and look at it in this way: how many 35-year-old running quarterbacks do you see that are having good careers? Because Cam Newton always had the advantage, was the biggest guy, never had a catastrophic injury, and he just fell off a cliff. I know he had a shoulder at one point, but he took a wear and tear career. Wear and tear. That's what happens because also when you're a really good runner, you rely on that a lot. And it's something you really like. Even this year, Lamar Jackson's cut weight. Why? Because he felt like he got caught a couple times last year, in my opinion, and he wants to keep his quickness. You're not keeping it forever. Look at Russell Wilson, dynamic player when he could turn his back to the defense and spin around and make incredible throws down the field. He can't do that. So what is he? He's barely holding on in tier 3, and he's on his third future Hall of Fame coach in 3 years. So for guys like that, it's the later in the career. It's not that Lamar Jackson's going to have a catastrophic injury because he scrambled. It's just, what's your body like when you take hits? How do you feel when you're 33 and can't run?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was another thing.
And then what's your other gear? What's your game then?
Yeah, I mean, that was another thing when I looked at the Lamar Jackson contract situation. I thought there would have been more of a drop off, like second contract for running quarterbacks, but the reality is it was beyond the second contract. It was, you have another 4 or 5 years on that second contract, and then things get complicated after that. But the problem is, like, people don't normally move on from a quarterback at that point. They extend them after, and then you can get into some problems at that point.
Yeah, it'll be really fascinating to see. That's why I do think it's important for all of the quarterbacks to develop as a passer, just because you're not only going to get so far in the playoffs anyway, and then late in your career, what do you do? What do you fall back on? If right now Lamar Jackson just never ran, he'd probably be just an average starting quarterback, right? You wouldn't say he's so good as a passer that he would be in the elite echelon of that. And so that's what you have to look out for when you're later in your career.
Yeah, and of course you want to score higher on Mike Sando's tiering, so you have to improve the
I'm
passing
sure
just to
that's
move
really
up
critically
there.
important. I think he'd rather take the paycheck and the MVP awards any day.
You need to get this written into the contracts. You need to get this, like they have like Pro Bowls and other things. Maybe you can get tier 1, Sando's tier 1 into the contracts.
For him, he's top 4. I mean, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
That is pretty good. That is
really
very, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike, I've taken a lot of your time here again in the middle of this whirlwind media tour. Anything else you want to plug? Everyone should read this. I'll link to it. Copious links all over the place to this and everything else that Mike's doing over at The Athletic. Anything else you want to plug or talk about going into the season?
So tomorrow, so today is, what day is it? It's Wednesday. So tomorrow we're going to publish, I took all of these tier rankings and I plugged them into the schedule. And then I had to get a little creative and make up kind of what I thought logical tiers would be for the rookie quarterbacks. So I put in, like, Caleb Williams, I put a little bit higher, like low in tier 3. I gave him a little bit of benefit of the doubt. And then whereas I put, like, I think Jaden Daniels, I maybe put where Anthony Richardson is, kind of in that range. And then for Nix, I think I just gave him a flat 4.0, like, hey, not enough info and a little bit lower of a pedigree. So
the preseason wasn't enough for you. The preseason wasn't enough for you to crown Bo Nix.
Well, I know, and I felt like the pedigree of Caleb combined with his performance, it would feel weird to just put him as a 4 and have him be tied with Jacoby Brissett or somebody like that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I want to move him up a little bit. So I put that all into the schedule to produce a 1 to 32 strength of opposing quarterback schedule with some notes in there too. I thought it was interesting, like, Joe Burrow and Herbert were hurt last year, so they were 4th place teams. So some of these teams that finished 4th place are drawing Burrow and Herbert this year. That's their reward for being in last place. So there could be some nuggets like that people are interested in seeing. That'll publish tomorrow in The Athletic.
No, that'd be great. I mean, obviously, I focus a lot on what quarterbacks are doing, and sometimes, believe it or not, it can get underplayed sometimes when we're looking at schedules and wins and range of probabilities for different teams going into the years. Okay, thank you so much, Mike. Again, follow Mike. Go check out all of his work, QB Tiers. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your research, and appreciate the way you go about your work too in this media environment. We get some really useful and measured information from you.
Hey, thanks so much, Kevin. Love coming on the show. Love doing the quarterback tiers, and glad we could have the combo.
Okay, thanks for everyone who is tuning in, whether live stream or podcast. And I'll be back at you on Tuesday with Josh Hermsmeyer again, going in and previewing everything going into the NFL season. Thanks so much, everybody.